Hi everyone, welcome or welcome back. If you don't know me, my name is Catherine, and if you do know me, I'm so grateful that you can make it here or make it back from wherever it is on the internet that you happen to drop in from. Just as a warning, this opinion piece will contain spoilers, so you have been warned. 3, 2, 1. Okay. It is my personal opinion that honestly, the most disturbing thing about the Euphoria season 3 finale isn't what happened, but actually what it seems to be saying about people like Rue. People with pain, people with shame, people with, internal conditions that once realized to the extremity of their dysfunction appear to find themselves at a certain narrative inevitability.
Rue was always going to die, and I'm genuinely confused and a little irritated at the reaction that I'm seeing online to her death.
The unfortunate truth is that broken people at some point do not come back. And I couldn't tell you what the threshold is for every person because every sufferer is different. Some reach a point where they don't remember their way back to normalcy. Some people, and this is really heartbreaking, but some people literally don't have somebody who cares about them enough to step into the painful maze, find them and bring them home. Some are tired of being forced to live through a trajectory that they don't have the will or the energy to commit to. And to be honest with you, I don't blame them. They literally don't want to, they don't care, they're tired, and everything has been spent on the sheer metabolic burden of continuing. And so for me, as a viewer, as somebody who watches these shows and, as you guys know, just enjoys analyzing these things, the most disturbing thing about Euphoria's narrative trajectory isn't so much the events, isn't so much the deaths, but what those events, right, what those occurrences actually propose.
Next, I do not care that Nate did not get a funeral. I think Nate got exactly what was coming to him, and I'm not at all upset about what happened.
That some lives, unfortunately, don't resolve to some coherent closure beyond their tragedy. They just end. So we have a story about a girl who endures excess, intimacy, addiction, collapse, psychological ruin. A girl quite honestly pulled through an almost ritual choreography of pleasure and punishment and regret and just chaos. She's got relapses, she's got regret, and obviously she leaves this trail of devastation behind her until eventually, at the end, she dies. Why? Well, I would naturally assume because it's realistic, because it's the most likely outcome.
I can't lie and say that I'm surprised that Rue died because I knew that she was going to be her demise. It had to happen that way. But the whole everybody dies plot, I was not expecting that. I'm not going to lie.
Because according to the logic, increasingly, I think in this modern day, attached to prestige tragedy and obviously echoed in the creative philosophy of the director, I think, Sam Levinson, the end of certain adolescent trajectories, particularly those saturated in addiction, exploitation, emotional dysregulation, is not recovery, but ruin. But realism, you guys, is not exactly neutral. It is interpretive. It is bound to an observed valuation. And I fear, honestly, in watching some of these shows that what we have decided to call realistic is more often than not just what we have decided is inevitable according to what we can measure against. There is obviously, an undeniable sobriety that death demands, particularly when it is used in creative architecture. And I think it's because intellectual realism is something that audiences are deeply craving just because, and I don't know, in fact I know, I'm not the only one who's noticed this, but you guys, there is such a diminishing quality in the entertainment we are being exposed to, especially nowadays. The movies are just so, I call them TikTok movies because they seem the plots seem to be AI written and particularly marketed for a TikTok audience. But anyway, my whole point in the whole interrogation of realism is that death in these stories is not merely an outcome, right? It is a credential of intellectual seriousness. But I want to pause there because I think you guys, something deeper has begun shifting, not just in storytelling, but actually within the moral grammar through which my generation interprets the personal existential narrative, particularly in a cultural moment where increasing numbers of young people are entertaining not just, the hypothetical, ideologically burdened idea of euthanasia, and not exclusively for terminal illnesses alone, but also for conditions of psychological suffering, where despair is increasingly spoken about, not as a condition requiring some form of healthy intervention, healthy addressal, but rather as a conclusion needing of acceptance.
A physically healthy 28-year-old woman is getting euthanized for depression. I'll explain. A Dutch woman, Zoraya Terbach, has decided to legally end her life life due to her struggles with crippling depression, autism, and borderline personality disorder. The Netherlands became the first country in the world to make assisted suicide legal in 2001. While it is generally used to end suffering of those suffering with terminal diseases or those in unbearable physical pain, Terbeck marks a new step in those choosing euthanasia to deal with mental suffering.
Guys, I want to talk about that, and I want to talk about the framing message beneath Euphoria.
Curious to know if everyone thought that Rue's death was necessary. I honestly don't think it was, because of the fact that, honestly, I think she was trying to get better. She wasn't necessarily on that path. She was sober the whole fucking season. And then all of a sudden, she dies from an accidental drug overdose. I mean, granted, the painkillers or whatever that she were given were laced, but I don't really think that that was the way for her to die, if that makes sense, if they wanted to go that route. And based on everything that, Zendaya was saying in interviews prior to this season, I mean, she obviously wanted Rue to get better, so.
Because I do not like how subtly modern narratives like Euphoria are training people, honestly, towards existential complacency. I don't like it. I am honestly quite unapologetically angry about it, and again, just as a warning, I do intend to come down quite harshly on this subject because I do believe it deserves harshness. And when death becomes an inevitability assigned to certain conditions of dysfunction, I believe that something profoundly dangerous happens. The argument for the alternative becomes, quite frankly, this might come off strong, but it does feel that way. The argument for the alternative, the argument for life, becomes intellectually embarrassing. I think it escapes us sometimes that life in and of itself is an argument. It is a series of reasons, right? In my personal opinion, to act in favor of continuity, supported by the actions that evidence faith in those reasons. So is death. Death is also an argument. And how persuasively, right, a civilization argues for either continuity or complete cessation matters enormously. Because what terrifies me is that so many things which are neither guarantees nor, outright inevitabilities are continuously being spoken about as if they are.
My Gen Z students know that they are absolutely cooked when it comes to this economy, this job market. They talk about it all the time. And I think partly being that self-aware of what's going on, whether it's through their parents or social media or whatever it might be, but knowing that the US is heading into dismal times is really where a lot of this lack of motivation to do things is coming from.
Now, if you've been familiar with any one of my videos, honestly, for a while, you'll know that for a long time, I've had an issue with the show. I've had an issue with the indulgent nature of its storytelling.
Because it gets to a point, it stops feeling like storytelling and starts feeling like indulgence, like weirdo indulgence. And I think the interesting thing is that Zendaya is the show's credibility. She's the emotional anchor, the one thing that makes it all feel like it's highbrow in a sense. But once you strip everything away, the glitter, the cameras, the shots and stuff like that, it's her that the audience connects to. However, the problem with the show is that it can't survive off of the credibility of like one person, especially if that one person is subtly trying to get off the show.
There is an excess to the content I find to be a little bit artless. I find to be honestly a little bit unnecessary. And you guys know this is not an issue about it being tasteless. I don't have an issue with explicit content being included in certain creative works. I'm really not somebody who opposes explicitness in function, but I will say when certain scenes have so little narrative function, I'm forced, unfortunately, to conclude that the only function they service is exploitative function.
Somebody in Hollywood really wanted to see Zendaya play a slave, because Black actors who reach the level of fame that Zendaya has are often forced to play a slave at some point in their career. And it just feels like to me that there was a group of people sitting around a table that said, how do we get Zendaya as close as possible to slavery without calling it slavery? Because now you got Sam Levinson, who is doing these post-Euphoria interviews, trying to make us believe that this was just a show about a drug addict. If you do drugs, you might die. This is what happens to a person like Rue. What do you mean by that, really? Because you started off the season with her being a drug mule for a group of racist Yahtzees. Then you had her misinterpreting the Bible, similarly to how the Bible was used as a weapon against slaves, as a tool of manipulation, because they didn't have the education requirements to understand the Bible. So much so that Rue ends up working for a human trafficker who buries her up to her neck. Then, if that isn't far enough, you have her running from a white man on a horse who lassos her by her feet and is dragging her back to the house where she had been forced to be a drug mule at. And as you can see, I love a country western moment. I don't mind me a lasso. I'm a country boy, but that chain of events leading up to her being dragged was batshit insane. You cannot make me believe that this is just a show about a drug addict.
The events particularly portrayed in Euphoria are, they are dramatic, they are hyper stylized, they are occasionally even excessive in their cinematographic rendering. And yet I would argue that they're not entirely unreal. Yes, they are embellished, okay? There's a lot of creative license used there, but they're not completely invented.
When Euphoria first came out, social media was going crazy, basically talking about how we were children and we were promoting doing all this other stuff. And now that it's 2026 and 2016 was 10 years ago, everybody's posting their high school pictures of them with their water bottle vodka, with their vapes, with their jewels, with their carts, okay, with their Swisher Sweets in the school parking lot, like, and we all know the bitches who's.
What I'm saying is that the psychic terrain they gesture toward is actually familiar to a great many people, including myself. Okay, when you have some familiar experience with addiction, depression, emotional dysregulation, or just like, guys, honestly, if you're familiar with the precipice of emotional collapse, you'll know this strange paradox that life in extremis doesn't feel unreal. It actually feels hyper real. Sometimes it can border on feeling cinematic in its intensity. But the interrogation I can't escape is what the intended narrative closure is for a story like this, especially so for young people who are still forming their sense of narrative possibility.
Especially the people in my family, they were like bullying me and they were like, you're just like them, you're just like Rue, you're just like Rue, you da 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 da. Oh, like every time Cassie was being a slut, they were like, look at you, you stupid slut, oh, you're a stupid slut. Like, so for y'all to be like, oh no, like that's not real. Nobody was really acting like that. I wasn't even acting like that at the time that came out, but best believe that my parental figures at the time were absolutely letting it be known that that's exactly how they view me.
There is indulgence, undoubtedly there is catharsis, but you guys, is there an argument? There is a difference between truth and fatalism, and I'm not convinced we're always told which one we're watching. But that being said, representation does matter, because as we all appreciate, representation doesn't just reflect experience.
Men will take you to the darkest depths of the earth. They will take you to hell and back, and they will drag another woman along with you. That does not mean that you guys actually have a beautiful friendship. You have just both been victim to the same man.
It stabilizes what experience is allowed to become, and that is why I think shows like this, for all of their problems, they resonate with audiences. They resonate specifically with young audiences navigating the consequences of their shame, of the habits they have adopted as maladaptive ways of dealing with what are actually existential crises, not merely addictions, not merely inclinations towards pleasure. You know what I mean? The other thing is that I want to maintain sensitivity to the fact that people are going to hear my criticisms, okay, and naturally assume that I have an issue with Rue dying, particularly along the argument that I have an issue with death itself. That is not the case. I don't have a problem with tragedy. I don't have a problem with death. Some of the greatest stories ever written end in death, as some of you guys know. My favorite stories, specifically old, like classical literature, they all end in death. They all contain yeah, they all contain some texture of severe tragedy. The problem is not that Rue dies, the problem is how death appears in the story. My concern is how it appears and what interpretive authority that how begins to exert over the imagination of the viewer. I would like to conscientize you guys to an idea called resurrection logic. Basically, it is the insistence that what is broken is not thereby rendered final, nor exhausted of meaning, nor reducible to the diagnostic summary of its collapse.
Hi guys, sorry I lost the footage for this section, but basically what I was just saying is that it's all about the interpretive refusal to let suffering become like completely identical with some conclusive understanding about a person. You know, the whole idea that suffering is not always, in all ways, you know, the most authoritative thing that one can say about a human being. But at the same time, you know, there is an inverse logic to this. There is the logic of closure. There is the logic of complete, absolute terminality. There is the logic that the broken thing is not only broken, but completed by its breaking.
And I think that modern prestige tragedy often oscillates between these two strong metaphysical instincts without recognizing, without acknowledging that that is what it's doing. Because we're not merely watching stories anymore. We are absorbing what things are allowed to mean by the way they existed, right? By the way they suffered, i.e. narrative ontologies. And I understand that this can feel like a heavy, complex idea, but it is important, I think, in modernity that we understand the argument of death. Because if we don't, then we won't be able to recognize coherences of life, even when we encounter stories, when we encounter experiences where death is legible. We need to, in my opinion, understand the kinds of deaths we are sympathizing the next generation to, because, like, guys, not all deaths are the same. Not all deaths mean the same thing. There are deaths of sacrifice. There are deaths of glory. There are deaths of martyrdom. There are deaths of necessity. Deaths of transformation. Deaths of consumption. Deaths that complete a life. You know, deaths that expose a life. I mean, I look at the biblical symbolism of hair. When we speak about hair, we are speaking about keratinized residue, right? No longer alive in and of itself, yet it grows precisely from living bodies, essentially becoming a visible record of metabolic vitality. I mean, it is paradoxically dead matter as evidence of life. And so it naturally, you know, becomes this beautiful sight of symbolic ambiguity. You know, it is something simultaneously disposable, but also worthy of consecration, especially when you look at ideas like the Nazarite vow. It is a dead substance, like I said, that grows from a living vessel, meaning that when it starts falling out, we have evidence that the living vessel is sick, dying, or just in some not great state, right? The hair becomes the hair, or lack thereof, actually becomes a sign of how well or otherwise the living vessel is doing. That's why also I think symbolically, hair is always associated with the outgrowth of your efforts to endure in this life. That is your glory, that is your beauty, and ideally you shouldn't aspire to be like Samson or Absalom and die by your glory. You don't want to be choked by your glory, right? You don't want to be exploited by your glory, because in symbolic anthropology, what grows out of you is never simply ornamental. You know, it is this stunning evidentiary record. It testifies to the type of life being lived. And so the deeper question becomes, you know, what sort of death are we witnessing when Rue dies? Is it a death of inevitability? Is it a death of exhaustion? Is it a death of narrative foreclosure? You know, is it a death of sacrifice, or is it something else entirely? What is the interpretation here, if, you know, there is any? Because as we know, like, this show has been very, in my opinion, confused in its symbolic integrations, but still, it's important. It's important we ask these questions. What is the interpretation? Because obviously the interpretation betrays the worldview of the interpreter. And this is where I feel compelled to conclude that I don't think that the series always understands the assumptions embedded in its own narrative logic. More specifically, I don't think it understands the theological residue embedded beneath the religious imagery it constantly invokes.
Oh, sorry, I was just reading the Bible. What's up? You know what's funny? That reminds me of something I read in the Bible yesterday. How does it go again? It's like, Yeah, I just need to bookmark my Bible. I just got up to a really good part. You know, it's so funny. I just saw this Bible sitting there, and I started reading it. Yeah, it was really good. Honestly, there's all these stories about sex and violence, and I just thought, the Bible is awesome. Yeah, it's really cool. You should read the Bible.
I think ultimately, and I realize you guys have said a lot because I always say a lot, and unfortunately most of my arguments only begin cohering somewhere around like the 45-minute mark of my videos. I'm going to try to make a very long argument precise, okay? This show is unbelievably dark, and I would not hesitate to recommend against it. Not for the fact that death is a prevalent subject matter within, you know, the narrative trajectory, but because of the kind of death that features in and around this show. You know, like I said earlier, death is an argument, and there are as many complexions of argument as there are complexions of death. And so what makes a show dark inherently isn't that it features death in general, again, just my opinion, but which of death's forms are featured in that show, you know?